The high archives of Silverspire smelled of crumbling beeswax, bitter oak gall ink, and the relentless northern frost that seeped through the heavy stone mortar. It was a room forgotten by the warriors of the pack, a place of dust and dead records. For Lyra Vance, it was a sanctuary. She sat alone at the massive oak drafting table, the only source of warmth coming from a single tallow candle flickering near her elbow. The room was perfectly still. Not the kind of silence that falls between words, the kind that swallows them whole. As a wolfless woman in a sovereign court that valued raw physical dominance above all else, Lyra had long ago learned the strategic value of being invisible. She dragged a stick of willow charcoal along the rough edge of the vellum spread before her. She was mapping the Black Pass. The jagged ravines required absolute precision. One wrong angle drawn on the parchment could send an entire marching column into a blind canyon. She rubbed the charcoal dust into the heavy paper with her thumb, smoothing the topographical lines that marked the steep limestone walls of the gorge. Her brother, Brandon, was out there in the freezing dark. His vanguard unit was scheduled to march into the narrowest throat of the pass before dawn. Lyra reached across the table and pulled the heavy leather cover of the Master Logistical Ledger toward her. It was the Master Administrative Record, containing the stamped troop movements and official coordinates for the King's campaign. She needed to cross-reference the supply line vectors with the vanguard's forward march. She ran her ink-stained index finger down the columns of numbers. The glow of the candle illuminated the rigid bureaucratic script. Her finger slowed. It stopped entirely. The coordinates did not align. Lyra leaned closer, her breath shallow in the frigid air. She compared the defensive ridge positions marked in the ledger with the natural choke points of the Black Pass. The official dispatch ordered the heavy infantry to hold a perimeter 3 miles behind the ridge. But the vanguard was ordered to push directly into the basin. They were being sent forward without flank support. Lyra's gaze dropped to the bottom margin of the ledger page. There, pressed into the parchment beside her brother's unit insignia, was a tiny, precise cross drawn in red wax. It was an old archival mark, the cartographic symbol for an expendable skirmish line. A unit deliberately positioned to be slaughtered so the main force could pivot. She did not gasp. She did not cry out. She simply stared at the red cross until the edges of her vision blurred. The charcoal stick snapped in her grip, the dry wood splintering against her palm. It was not a tactical error. The ink was dry. The official seal was pressed cleanly into the bottom of the page. It was a deliberate, engineered massacre. Lyra wiped the black dust from her hands onto her heavy linen apron. She needed to find Orin. The old archive keeper would know how to route a warning directly to the King's tent. She closed the Black Pass ledger, the heavy leather cover falling shut with a muffled thud that echoed into the vaulted ceiling. She reached for her lantern. The heavy oak door at the far end of the corridor groaned on its iron hinges. The sound was wrong. Orin dragged his feet when he walked, his boots shuffling against the flagstones. These footsteps were hard, unhurried, and sharp, the measured, arrogant cadence of a high-ranking wolf. Lyra extinguished her candle with a quick pinch of her fingers. She did not panic. She stepped backward, sliding smoothly behind the heavy wool tapestry that covered the alcove of the eastern wall. The thick fabric smelled of damp dust and ancient moth rot. She pressed her spine flat against the freezing masonry, willing her lungs to slow their frantic expansion. Through a frayed tear in the wool, she had a narrow view of the drafting table. Beta Kalen Thorne stepped into the archive. He was flanked by a subordinate commander, though the archivist kept her eyes fixed on Kalen's polished leather boots. The scent of sharp ozone and expensive pine oil rolled into the room, masking the smell of the old parchment. "The King's vanguard marches at dawn," Kalen said. His voice was a low, smooth drawl that carried perfectly in the quiet room. He leaned his hip against the drafting table, right beside the closed ledger. "They will advance into the gorge as ordered, Beta," the commander replied, his tone tight, more with nervous energy. "But if the enemy collapses the northern ridge, the vanguard will be trapped. King Valerius will demand a rescue deployment." "King Valerius is too obsessed with honor," Kalen murmured. From his coat, he produced a small, silver folding blade. He opened it with a soft metallic click and casually began to clean the dirt from under his fingernails. "Honor does not secure borders. Strategy does. The vanguard is full of loyalists who question my authority. Let the enemy chew them to pieces in the basin." Lyra held her breath. The cold from the stone wall was seeping through her wool dress, biting into her shoulder blades, but she did not dare shiver. "If the vanguard falls, the king will sound a retreat," the commander argued cautiously. "He will pull the main force back to save them." Kalen inspected his thumb, scraping a fleck of dirt from the nail. "The king cannot sound a retreat if he does not hold the horn." The man closed the silver blade with a sharp snap. "I have the rotation schedule for the High Sanctuary. I will take the Sunderhorn tonight. When the vanguard is surrounded, I will wait exactly 1 hour. Then, I will sound the retreat myself. A false call, echoing off the mountains." The implications settled into Lyra's chest like cold water filling a cracked stone. The relic was cast from ancient frost alloy. It was the only instrument in the kingdom whose command carried the absolute, supernatural weight of the Alpha's bloodline. If it sounded, no soldier could disobey the instinct to fall back. If Kalen blew the horn an hour too late, the vanguard would be forced to turn their backs and retreat through the narrowest part of the gorge while the enemy was already upon them. It would not be a battle. It would be an execution. "And the king?" the commander asked. "Valerius will be too far up the eastern ridge to reach them in time," Kalen said smoothly. "He will arrive to find a tragedy. And I will be the one holding the horn, the grieving Beta who tried to call them back." He turned and tapped his knuckles lightly against the heavy leather book. "Make sure the forward scouts report the path is clear. The trap closes at dawn." The Beta walked out of the archive, the commander following closely at his heels. The heavy door groaned shut, leaving the room in absolute darkness. Lyra remained pressed against the wall for a long time. The freezing stone had sapped the warmth from her limbs, leaving her fingers stiff and aching. She stepped out from behind the tapestry. The air in the room felt thinner, suffocating. Kalen was going to use the sacred relic to murder her brother. He was going to steal it from the High Sanctuary tonight. She looked down at her ink-stained hands in the dark. She was a wolfless archivist. She had no authority, no physical strength, and no voice in the council. But she knew the layout of the keep better than the guards who walked it, and she knew exactly where the High Sanctuary was. The stone steps leading into the High Sanctuary were not carved for the silent passage of an archivist. They were built for the heavy, armored tread of sovereign guards, designed by ancient architects to echo and announce any approaching threat. Lyra knew the acoustic geometry of the keep better than anyone who lived within its walls. She had drawn the structural elevations herself, mapping the blind spots, the drafts, and the precise hollows under the floorboards. Her soft-soled boots found the edges of the granite stairs where the stone met the wall, stepping only where the structural friction would absorb the weight of her body. The sanctuary itself smelled of old beeswax, dormant power, and the sharp metallic tang of ozone. Moonlight bled through the narrow high windows, casting long, warped shadows across the polished obsidian floor. In the center of the vast, empty chamber stood a single pedestal of dark iron. Resting atop a velvet plinth, secured beneath a heavy glass display case, was the Sunderhorn. Lyra did not move toward it immediately. She remained completely still in the shadow of a marble pillar, calculating the ambient noise of the fortress. Outside the high-arched window, the massive wooden water wheel in the lower courtyard churned against the half-frozen current of the Black River. Ice had encrusted its broad wooden paddles over the course of the bitter night, turning every rotation into a grinding, mechanical agony. The sequence was deeply predictable to anyone who bothered to listen. A long, straining groan echoed as the wetwood lifted the ice into the air. A hollow, suspended pause followed at the apex of the turn. Then came a violent, shattering clank as the heavy paddle struck the frozen surface of the water below. The brass hinges of the relic case were thoroughly oxidized. Lifting the glass would produce a sharp, metallic shriek that would easily alert the sentries stationed at the bottom of the sanctuary tower. Lyra stepped out of the shadows, crossing the obsidian floor with measured, deliberate strides. She placed her bare, ink-stained fingers on the cold brass latch of the case. She waited. She listened to the heavy machinery outside. Groan. The wood strained against the current, vibrating faintly through the soles of her boots. Pause. The wheel reached its apex. Lyra tightened her grip, her knuckles turning bone-white under the moonlight. Clank. As the paddle violently shattered the river ice, Lyra ripped the glass case upward. The sharp, agonizing screech of the dry brass hinges was instantly swallowed by the heavy, mechanical collision outside. When the ambient silence of the sanctuary returned, the glass was fully open. The relic lay entirely exposed. The sacred horn was forged from an ancient frost alloy, its heavy silver surface etched with sovereign runes that seemed to actively repel the dim light. It did not merely chill the air around it. The metal operated as a void, pulling the ambient warmth from the room. A layer of pale white frost coated the velvet beneath its jagged mouthpiece. Lyra reached into the case and lifted it. The sheer weight of the artifact dragged her wrists downward. It was heavier than any ledger, denser than solid iron. She knew immediately that she could not carry it in her leather satchel. The guards at the lower perimeter were under strict orders to search all outgoing bags before the dawn vanguard march. Furthermore, the horn possessed a natural resonance. If it bumped against the buckles of a satchel, it would produce a low, carrying hum. It had to be completely muffled. It had to be hidden where no sovereign guard would ever dare to search a low-ranking woman. She set the heavy silver down on the edge of the iron pedestal. With trembling, numb fingers, she reached up and began to unlace the collar of her heavy winter tunic. The freezing air of the sanctuary bit immediately into the exposed skin of her throat and chest. Lyra peeled back the thick layers of wool and the coarse linen of her undershirt, creating a deep pocket against her bare flesh. Her breath plumed in the dark air. She picked up the sunderhorn again, turning the curved, jagged edge of the metal so it would align with the hollow of her collarbone and the slope of her ribs. She pressed the frost alloy directly against her bare skin. The sudden flesh-searing cold was an absolute physical violation. It did not feel like ice. It felt like holding a burning coal. The violent drop in temperature shocked her nervous system, causing her lungs to seize and her muscles to lock rigid. A scream tore its way up her throat, an involuntary, animal response to the searing agony of the metal drinking her body heat. Lyra violently dragged the thick wool of her left sleeve to her mouth and bit down. She bit down with all the force in her jaw, burying the scream in the coarse fabric. The taste of lanolin and dirt flooded her tongue. Tears of sheer, blinding pain spilled over her eyelashes, freezing almost instantly against her pale cheeks. She forced herself to breathe through her nose, taking shallow, shuddering gasps as the silver settled heavily against her sternum. She did not let go. She reached for the long, thick strips of binding linen she had brought from the archives, wrapping them tightly around her chest, strapping the heavy relic flush against her ribs. She pulled the linen brutally tight. forcing the metal deeper into her flesh to ensure the outer silhouette of her tunic would remain flat. Beneath the bindings, the frost alloy began to blister her skin, searing a permanent, dark sunder bruise into the tissue over her heart. The pain was a suffocating pressure, a relentless, freezing ache that radiated down her arms and up into her jaw. Then, a secondary sensation began to emerge from the artifact. The sovereign artifact was semi-sentient, designed to amplify the breath and will of a sovereign warrior. Trapped tightly against the chest of a terrified wolfless cartographer, the frost alloy sought a rhythm to amplify. As Lyra's heart hammered frantically against her ribs in sheer panic, the ancient silver absorbed the mechanical vibration of her pulse. The metal began to thrum. It was a slow, heavy resonance, echoing the exact, rapid cadence of her heartbeat. The vibration seeped into her bones, making her own pulse feel dangerously loud, as though her chest had become an acoustic chamber for the relic. Lyra released her sleeve from her teeth, her breathing ragged but controlled. She laced her heavy wool tunic back to her throat, buttoning the thick collar to hide the dark, spreading frostburn creeping up her neck. The sheer weight of the strapped horn dragged her posture forward, demanding that she hunch. Through sheer, stubborn willpower, she locked her spinal muscles and forced herself to stand perfectly straight. She turned away from the empty glass case, carrying the freezing silence of the kingdom against her own beating heart, and walked back down the stone steps into the dark. The wind howling through the black pass carried the bitter scent of ozone, crushed pine needles, and fresh copper. Brandon Vance tightened his cracked knuckles around the leather-wrapped hilt of his broadsword, letting the freezing temperature of the iron ground him against the chaotic geometry of the ravine. The royal vanguard was stretched dangerously thin. The northern ridge offered zero tactical cover, leaving his infantry unit entirely exposed to a relentless downhill assault from the enemy line. They were holding a geographical death trap, a steep incline of packed ice and loose shale, and every soldier shivering in the snow understood the mathematics of their position. According to standard military doctrine, this was the exact moment their defensive formation should break. Brandon wiped a thick, freezing mixture of frost and blood from his left eye, his vision continually blurring against the blinding white of the mountain storm. He tilted his head, his frost-bitten ears straining through the deafening clash of steel and breaking wood. He was listening for a signal he mathematically expected, a sound that would legally compel them to abandon the high ground. He was waiting for the retreat call. He braced himself for the deep, earth-shattering resonance of the Sunder Horn, the only command that could force the vanguard to fall back into the lower valley, right into the vulnerable bottleneck, where the vanguard leader secretly suspected an ambush waited in the fog. He swung his blade, executing a short, brutal arc that bought his flank 3 seconds of breathing room. The freezing air burned his lungs like swallowed glass. Another minute passed in agonizing slow motion, then another. He wiped his face again, his chest heaving, his boots sliding backward an inch in the bloody slush. He listened. Nothing came, only the shriek of the northern gale and the visceral crunch of boots stomping on packed ice. The expected bellow of the royal relic never arrived. The silence that fell over the tactical frequency of the battlefield was an absolute, defining void. The man let that knowledge settle into his exhausted muscles, like cold water sinking into stone. Without the official, undeniable order to fall back, a royal soldier had no choice but to push forward. The lack of a command became its own kind of pure tactical clarity. He did not know why the high sanctuary at Silverspire remained quiet. He did not know what administrative delay, mechanical failure, or sudden act of treasonous mercy had kept the silver instrument from being raised to a herald's lips. He only knew the physical reality of the moment. Because the retreat was never sounded, His men stopped looking backward over their shoulders. They drove their heavy boots deeper into the freezing mud, tightened their interlocking shield wall, and held the broken line. The absolute silence of the mountain forced them to survive. Miles away from the blood-stained snow, beneath the soaring vaulted ceilings of the Silverspire keep, the air smelled of stale beeswax and undisturbed archive dust. Caelan Thorn stood dead center in the high sanctuary, his perfectly tailored dark wool coat absorbing the dim grey morning light filtering through the high windows. He did not move his feet. He did not speak a word to the empty room. He simply stared at the velvet-lined pedestal resting atop the polished marble altar of the ancestors. The depression in the crushed black velvet was still clearly visible, shaped perfectly to the jagged, curved dimensions of the ancient frost alloy relic, but the heavy silver was gone. Caelan slowly raised his right hand. His manicured fingers hovered over the empty space where the instrument should have rested, trembling with a faint, imperceptible tremor that he immediately forced down by clenching his fist into a tight knot. His entire political architecture, the forged dispatch orders, the deliberately shifted supply lines, the carefully arranged slaughter waiting in the lower valley, relied entirely on the indisputable, acoustic authority of that single object. The vanguard was commanded by stubborn, literal men who would never abandon a defensive line on a written order or a relayed verbal command. They would only break their shield formation for the deep supernatural resonance of the king's ancestral instrument. Without the physical relic to broadcast the lie, his treason was entirely paralyzed. The beta let his hand drop to his side, his polished, performative composure fracturing in the freezing silence of the sanctuary. Someone had bypassed the outer perimeter guards. Someone had understood the internal geography of the keep well enough to enter the most secure chamber in the territory without drawing a single breath of alarm. He turned slowly on his heel, his leather boots clicking sharply against the polished stone floor. Two of his personal sentries stood at attention by the heavy oak doors, their faces impassive but their postures rigid with sudden, suffocating tension. Caelan did not yell at them. He did not resort to the loud, aggressive dominance that lesser men used to mask their sudden incompetence. Instead, he walked slowly toward the guards, his voice dropping to a smooth, lethal whisper that barely disturbed the dust motes in the air. He ordered a complete, undocumented lockdown of the lower levels. He instructed them to search every servant's quarter, every drafty corridor, and every forgotten archive room without alerting the royal guard or creating a public panic. The thief had to be found, and the silver recovered before the king returned from the front lines. The ambitious politician adjusted the stiff cuffs of his coat, the cold realization finally settling over him that his meticulous, bloodless coup was unraveling completely because he had lost physical control of a single piece of metal. The northern front smelled of pulverized granite, frozen pine, and the unmistakable copper tang of freshly spilled blood. Alpha King Valerius Vaughn moved through the chaos of the northern skirmish with the mechanical precision of a ruler who understood warfare as geometry. He did not waste motion. He swung his massive iron greatsword in wide arcs, driving the enemy line back toward the crags. The wind howled through the narrow mountain corridor, drowning out the clatter of steel. Victory was a matter of mathematics, of holding the vanguard steady. Valerius raised his gauntleted hand to signal the forward press. The command never left his throat. A sudden, violent pressure seized the center of his chest. It was not the sharp bite of a rebel arrow, nor the crushing weight of a war hammer. It felt as though a frozen wedge had been driven directly between his ribs. The air rushed out of his lungs in a single gasp. He stumbled. His greatsword slipped from his armored fingers. It struck the snowpack with a heavy thud, burying itself halfway into the frozen earth. Around him, the immediate circle of combat fractured. The royal guards faltered at the sight of the king, halting in the middle of a strike. Shields raised instantly, forming a protective ring around his kneeling form. They shouted questions, scanning the tree line for hidden archers, searching for the physical wound that had brought the Alpha to his knees. There was no physical wound to find. Valerius gripped the thick leather and steel of his own breastplate, his knuckles turning white beneath his gauntlets. He pressed his palm hard against his sternum, attempting to crush the sensation beneath the armor. Inside his chest, beneath his own slow and measured pulse, a second heartbeat hammered. It was frantic. It was erratic. It was terrified. The rhythm drummed against the inside of his ribs, echoing through his bone marrow like a physical blow. Thump, thump. A pause filled with jagged, agonizing cold. Thump, thump, thump. It was not the steady pulse of a soldier engaged in combat. It was the desperate, fluttering rhythm of a creature caught in a trap, freezing in the dark. The sensory intrusion was absolute. The phantom beat dragged a wave of paralyzing cold through his veins, dropping his core temperature in seconds. The magic of the Sunder Horn had tethered itself to his bloodline, turning his body into a receiver for someone else's agony. Every time the foreign heart stuttered, Valerius felt the frostbite gnawing at his own skin. He could not hear the shouts of his captains. The foreign pulse drowned out the battlefield entirely, hijacking his nervous system with ruthless efficiency. He closed his eyes. The pain was not merely a warning, it was a beacon. Valerius forced himself upright, his breath misting heavily in the freezing air. His commanders were already moving in, their voices muffled beneath the overwhelming drumming in his ears. One of the lieutenants caught his arm, gesturing wildly toward the medical encampment behind the vanguard line. The soldier's mouth moved, likely shouting for a healer, but Valerius shoved the man away with a violent surge of force. He did not need a healer. He needed to find the source of the vibration tearing his chest apart. Turning his back on the skirmish, the king began to walk. The direction was not chosen by tactical reasoning. It was dictated entirely by the magnetic pull of the phantom pulse. When he faced the steep descent that led back toward the fortress, the erratic heartbeat in his ribs flared with a sickening spike of cold validation. "Bring the horses," a captain bellowed over the wind, motioning for the royal detail to mount up. Valerius did not wait for the animals. He did not issue a countermand or explain his departure. He simply broke into a heavy ground-eating run. The snowpack was deep, treacherous with hidden ice and jagged rock, terrain that demanded a slow traverse. He ignored the risks. His boots shattered the frozen crust, kicking up sprays of white powder as he pushed his body to match the desperate rhythm echoing inside his skull. The royal detail scrambled to follow, their heavy armor clanking awkwardly. They brought the reins of his warhorse, shouting for him to mount. He ignored them completely. Riding required balance, required the subtle communication of knees and reins, required a physical stillness that the agony in his chest would not permit. The only way to endure the violent intrusion was to move, to hunt, to close the distance between himself and the terrifying cold. As he ran, the sheer weight of his combat gear became intolerable. He unclasped his heavy iron shoulder guards, letting them fall uselessly into the snowbank without breaking his stride. He tore the thick wool cloak from his throat, leaving it to flutter in the wind like a discarded banner. He did not feel the biting chill of the mountain air against his exposed tunic. The cold, radiating from the foreign heartbeat, was vastly more profound than the weather, freezing him from the inside out. The terrain blurred. The towering pines became dark streaks against the grey sky. He navigated the treacherous switchbacks purely by the shifting intensity of the pain. If he veered too far west, the pulse grew faint, and the freezing sensation intensified, warning him he was losing the connection. When he corrected his course toward the lower valleys, the heartbeat thundered with terrifying clarity, reverberating through his teeth. He was not acting as the commander of the Northern Army. He had abandoned protocol, left his vanguard in the hands of his captains, and discarded every rule of royal preservation. The primitive, unyielding instinct to stop the agonizing drumming overrode decades of military discipline. He vaulted over a fallen cedar, his boots hitting the hard-packed dirt of the lower trail. The pulse hitched. It skipped a full beat, leaving a hollow, breathless void in his chest that tasted of impending death. Then it slammed back into rhythm, weaker, slower, struggling against an invisible weight. Valerius ran faster. The fortress loomed in the distance, a dark shape against the snow, and the drumming was dragging him straight toward its foundations. The iron-studded doors of Silverspire Keep groaned open, admitting the freezing northern wind before they admitted the sovereign. Valerius Vaughan strode through the gates on foot, breathing heavily, his fur cloak sweeping against the cobblestones. The usual organized chaos of the returning guard, the clattering of steel, the shouted commands, the sharp scent of ozone and horse sweat seemed to fracture around him. The sentries noticed it first. Their Alpha King had arrived without his warhorse, and he did not issue the customary orders for the perimeter watch. He did not ask for the regional commanders. He simply stood in the center of the courtyard, his chin tilted slightly downward. He was listening to the ice. The sudden, terrifying stillness of the king drew worried whispers from the grooms and the armorers. They parted like water, leaving a wide circle of empty space around the sovereign. The pulse in his chest was a steady, agonizing drumbeat, a rhythmic thud that had nothing to do with his own heart. It was a frantic cadence, echoing through his blood, pulling his focus inward with absolute gravity. The sensory lock was profound. The world became grey noise. Orin Stursing descended the stone steps from the administrative wing, his arms loaded with heavily inked casualty reports. The head archivist moved with the brisk, unbothered pace of a man who valued historical accuracy over military pageantry. Orin stopped a few paces from the sovereign, offering a sharp bow before holding out the topmost ledger. His voice was crisp, reciting the initial tallies from the outer skirmishes. The numbers were meant to ground the king in tactical reality. Valerius did not look at the parchment. He did not look at Orin. The king raised one gloved hand, the leather creaking slightly in the cold air. The gesture was minimal, but it possessed enough authority to cut the archivist's report dead in his throat. Orin stopped speaking. He lowered the casualty report, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion as the heavy silence settled over the courtyard. Valerius tilted his head toward the massive stone structure of the keep itself, his jaw set in a tight line. The king was simply listening to a sound no one else could hear. The sovereign brushed past the head archivist without a single word of acknowledgement. The heavy velvet of his brushed against Orin's ledger, leaving a smear of frost on the administrative ink. Valerius moved toward the inner corridor, his boots striking the polished stone with deliberate intent. The normal military business of the court evaporated in his wake. The guards exchanged uneasy glances, entirely unsure how to protect a king from an invisible threat. Valerius ignored them all. He was focused entirely on the phantom drumming that resonated in the marrow of his own bones. The pulse was drawing him downward. The descent into the lower levels of Silverspire Keep was a transition marked by the slow death of natural light and the creeping bite of damp stone. Valerius walked past the bustling servants' quarters, moving steadily toward the forgotten belly of the fortress. The air grew progressively thinner, carrying the distinct scent of ancient vellum and undisturbed dust. These were the deep archives. It was the domain of the wolfless clerks and the forgotten historians. Yet the frantic heartbeat pulling at his chest grew stronger with every step downward. The rhythm was inescapable. The stone walls of the narrow stairwell were freezing to the touch. Valerius removed his heavy leather glove, letting it drop carelessly onto the stairs behind him. He pressed his bare palm flat against the jagged, unpolished granite. He did not rely on the supernatural tracking of a wolf's scent. There was no trail of blood, no footprint left in the mud. He relied on the pure, low-frequency tactile feedback of the architecture itself. Through his fingertips, he felt the faint, rhythmic vibration echoing through the bedrock. It was a physical hum, a resonance that synced perfectly with the phantom agony radiating behind his own ribs. The heartbeat was incredibly fast, the unmistakable rhythm of a mortal body in the grip of severe physical shock. The freezing sensation that accompanied the pulse was a specific kind of cold. It was not the ambient chill of the northern winter. It was the bitter, biting frost of ancient alloy, a cold that drank warmth and refused to give it back. Valerius let that knowledge settle into him like cold water into stone, slow, thorough, filling every crack. Someone in the depths of his fortress had taken the ancestral relic, and the silver was attempting to freeze them from the inside out. He stepped off the final stair, entering the cavernous expanse of the main geographical archive. The vast room was a labyrinth of towering wooden shelves, overflowing with tightly rolled maps and dusty treaty documents. The only illumination came from a single, sputtering tallow candle on a distant reading desk, casting long skeletal shadows across the floor. Valerius stood perfectly still at the edge of the darkness. He closed his eyes, letting his bare palm rest against the final archway. The vibration here was undeniable. It rattled the loose stones. The phantom pulse in his chest was now so loud it threatened to crack his sternum. He moved silently down the central aisle, navigating the maze of shelves without a sound. The air temperature here was unnaturally low, the ambient moisture freezing into delicate patterns of frost across the nearby wooden tables. The king did not draw a weapon. The tactical reality of the situation had shifted entirely. The sovereign was not hunting an armed assassin. He was hunting a dying heartbeat. As he rounded the final row of map cabinets, the low-frequency hum vibrating through the floorboards pointed directly toward a small, secluded desk. The sovereign moved toward the flickering candlelight, ready to uncover exactly who was paying the ultimate physical price in the freezing dark. Lyra stood perfectly still behind her tilted drafting desk, the sudden scent of ozone, crushed pine, and fresh blood drifting from the shadows. She had spent the last 2 hours reviewing the supply ledgers, attempting to hide her treason behind the mundane, invisible labor of the archives. The tallow candles sputtered in their iron sconces, casting long, wavering shadows that now caught the silhouette of the Alpha King, emerging from the endless rows of tactical registries. The Sunderhorn remained pressed directly against her bare collarbone, bound tightly under 3 layers of thick wool and linen wrappings. The ancient silver relic did not merely chill the air around it. It actively drank the warmth from her bloodstream, radiating a deep, consuming frost that had long since numbed her fingers to the bone. Every breath she took felt like inhaling crushed glass, the cold of the metal biting deeper into her sternum. She held a sliver of compressed charcoal, attempting to trace a topographical elevation line of the jagged gorge onto a fresh sheet of vellum. She was trying to build a mental wall of routine against the freezing agony in her chest, but her muscles simply refused to obey the commands of her mind. Then came the footsteps. They were unhurried, impossibly heavy, and deliberate, echoing against the cold stone floor of the corridor with the rhythm of absolute authority. Valerius Vaughn moved through the silence as if he owned the very air, lacking the nervous, frantic energy of lesser men. As his tall, fur-draped silhouette filled the narrow archway of the map room, The atmospheric pressure of the space fundamentally shifted. The entire hall seemed to orient toward him the way iron filings orient toward a lodestone, pressing down on the confined space like a physical weight. The familiar smell of old dust and dry beeswax was instantly replaced by the territorial dominance of the sovereign's presence. Lyra's breath caught in the back of her throat, producing a faint, ragged rasp. The certainty of her fate did not arrive as a sudden physical shock, but rather as a slow, absolute settling of weight in her stomach. Her heartbeat spiked, hammering violently against her ribs in a frantic rhythm of biological survival. In that exact fraction of a second, Valerius stopped walking. He raised one heavy, gauntleted hand to his own chest, his jaw tightening as if he had been struck by an invisible, internal blow. The acoustic connection between the ancient frost alloy relic and the Alpha King was absolute. The narrow, stone-vaulted room filled with the deafening, rhythmic thud of her own racing pulse. It was not a sound that could be heard by the outer guards in the courtyard. It was a supernatural resonance vibrating directly through the sovereign bloodline, making the air in the room feel too thick to pull into the lungs. Her numb, trembling fingers finally failed her. The heavy glass inkwell slipped from her rigid grasp, dropping onto the edge of the tilted wooden desk. It shattered with a sharp, violent crack that echoed through the archives. Dark, viscous iron gall ink bled out over the polished oak grain, soaking immediately into the vellum maps and spreading across the floorboards like a dark wound that refused to close. She watched the black stain expand, the chaotic spread of the liquid perfectly mirroring the cold paralysis that was currently locking her limbs. She did not scream. She did not drop to her knees to beg for mercy. Nor did she attempt to run toward the narrow servant's exit, hidden behind the geographical shelves. She had spent years mastering the art of withholding her tears in spaces where vulnerability was punished. She merely stood trapped behind the ruined topography, letting the freezing cold of the hidden relic anchor her trembling posture. Valerius stepped fully over the threshold, his pale, analytical gaze locking directly onto the hollow of her throat, where the frantic pulse originated. It was a profound, suffocating quiet that devoured any possibility of speech. "Where is the relic, archivist?" Valerius asked. The command was spoken barely above a whisper. It lacked the feral, chest-deep aggression so common to the Pack's military elite, yet it carried the absolute, undeniable weight of sovereign law. He did not lunge across the room to grab her wrists. He did not shatter the remaining wooden furniture to force her compliance. Instead, he simply rested his right hand on the hilt of his executioner's blade, a massive ancient iron broadsword designed specifically for traitors of the highest order. The leather of his scabbard creaked softly in the quiet room, a purely mechanical sound that signaled the end of a life. Lyra tried to form an answer, to articulate the tactical truth of the northern deployment, but her lips were tinted a pale, bruised blue. Severe hypothermia had finally breached her last layer of physical endurance. The frozen horn was actively draining the core heat from her internal organs, turning her quiet shivering into violent, uncontrollable muscular spasms. She gripped the edge of the ink-stained desk, the sharp wood biting into her palms as she fought to keep her spine perfectly straight under the king's scrutiny. Her vision was beginning to narrow at the edges, the grey fog of freezing death encroaching on her peripheral sight. She experienced the specific, hollow ache that accompanied the fulfillment of a grim prediction. The silver was killing her exactly as the ancient texts had warned. Valerius stepped forward, his heavy boots crushing the shards of the broken inkwell into the stone floor. His grip tightened on the cold iron hilt as he prepared to draw the weapon. Treason during a military campaign demanded an immediate physical conclusion. He pulled the blade a single inch from its leather sheath, the ring of metal slicing through the heavy air. Then He froze. A violent shudder ripped through his broad shoulders, halting his forward momentum entirely. The Alpha King's breath plumed stark white in the dimly lit room, his chest heaving as a sudden, unnatural cold seized his own heavily muscled torso. The sensory feedback loop between the Sovereign and the stolen horn had fully closed. Whatever ancient, volatile frost magic tied the artifact to the royal bloodline was now transmitting her physical collapse directly into his own nervous system. Valerius felt his own internal body temperature plummet in an instant. The dominant, unyielding strength that allowed him to command armies was suddenly hollowed out by the sheer freezing agony emanating from the wolfless woman standing 3 paces away. He felt the phantom weight of the heavy silver pressing against his own sternum, mimicking the exact shape of the frostburn, searing into her flesh. He released the hilt of his blade entirely, stepping back as his own large hands began to tremble with the mirrored hypothermia. The devastating realization settled over his severe, calculated features, reorienting his understanding of the crime. She was not just hiding the stolen silver for political gain. She was actively enduring it. No thief would willingly bind a lethal, heat-draining artifact to their own bare skin and stand silently as it killed them. The king did not reach for the sword again. He left the heavy iron resting quietly in the dark scabbard, his pale eyes tracking the violent shudders tearing through her small frame as he calculated the absolute impossibility of her survival. The archive room felt heavy, the draught carrying the metallic scent of old parchment and the biting chill of the northern wind. Valerius stood before her, a towering figure, maintaining a rigid, terrifying stillness. He did not raise his voice when he finally spoke. He did not need to. The ancient silver relic of his bloodline was missing, yet its supernatural resonance remained firmly anchored to this wolfless archivist who sat shivering on a wooden stool. Lyra's fingers were stiff, the joints aching from the deep, unnatural cold that had seeped into her bones. She knew what she had to show him. To deny the theft was impossible. The physical evidence was literally burned into her flesh. Moving with careful, deliberate slowness, she lifted her numb hands to the thick, woolen collar of her winter bindings. The fabric crackled faintly, stiffened by the frost that had bloomed outward from her skin. Valerius watched her every movement. He did not step closer, maintaining a deliberate physical distance that allowed her the dignity of unfastening her own garments without coercion. Slowly, Lyra pulled the heavy wool aside. She peeled back the rigid linen shift beneath it, exposing the hollow of her collarbone. The sight of it made the air in the room seem to drop another 10 degrees. There, stamped violently into the pale skin over her heart, was the sunder bruise. It was a localized ring of deep crystallized frost, the fragile tissue frozen and scarred in the exact, jagged shape of the royal war horn's mouthpiece. The edges of the wound were a terrible, bruised purple, giving way to a center of pure, icy white, where the blood had simply stopped flowing. Faintest wisps of silver light seemed to pulse from the frozen veins beneath the scar, beating in perfect time with the frantic rhythm Valerius had felt across the mountain range. The Sunderhorn drank the warmth of any mortal foolish enough to hold it, to press it against bare skin. To bury its heavy, freezing mass over a beating heart for hours was an act of profound self-destruction. Valerius stared at the frostburn, the absolute mathematical proof of her suffering. She had turned her own body into a vault for the artifact, bearing an agony that would have broken a seasoned vanguard warrior. Lyra held the collar back for a long, quiet moment, letting the Sovereign look upon the undeniable physical damage of her treason. She felt the particular kind of pain that comes not from surprise, but from confirmation. The cold was a permanent fixture in her chest now, a heavy stone that refused to thaw. When she finally let the stiff wool fall back into place, covering the ruined skin, The silence in the archives swallowed them both. The ensuing stillness was absolute, a heavy void that devoured all remaining sound. Lyra did not look up into the king's eyes. She simply lowered her hands, folding them neatly in her lap to physically mask their continuous trembling. The posture was one of absolute pragmatic surrender. She was an archivist, a keeper of facts and ledgers, and she understood the structural penalty for stealing a sovereign relic. "I stole it," Lyra said. Her voice was quiet, lacking any trace of the hysterical pleading that typically accompanied a confession of treason. It carried a steady, unyielding weight that fiercely contradicted her physical frailty. She kept her gaze fixed on the ink-stained grain of the desk beside her, speaking with the measured cadence of someone reading a factual report. "I took the Sunderhorn from the High Sanctuary before the midnight watch changed." Viserius remained perfectly still. The metallic scent of ozone and his own cold authority filled the space between them. Why? It was a single command for truth, stripped of anger. "Because the retreat call was a lie," Lyra answered, her breath pluming faintly in the freezing air. "I mapped the coordinates for the Black Pass deployment. The terrain forms a natural choke point at the northern ravine. Yesterday I discovered a modified tactical directive. Beta Kalen intended to sound the horn 3 hours into the morning skirmish." She paused, her cracked knuckles whitening slightly as she pressed her fingers together. "The vanguard is stationed at the base of the ravine. My brother, Brandon, holds the left flank. If the horn had sounded, the vanguard would have been forced by pack law to fall back. They would have retreated directly into the narrowest section of the pass, where the enemy ambush is waiting." She did not embellish the betrayal. She did not weep for her brother's danger. She offered the mechanics of the slaughter exactly as she had calculated them on her drafting table. "No one would have questioned the order," Lyra continued. "The horn is absolute. The only way to silence the command was to remove the instrument. If I had simply taken it, the Beta's trackers would have caught me before I cleared the outer gates. So I bound it beneath my clothes. I knew the frost alloy would hide its own scent if it was actively draining a mortal's warmth." Valerius listened to the sheer, terrifying logic of her actions. She had not acted out of political ambition or madness. She had recognized a systemic, institutional murder, and had countered it with a calculated sacrifice of her own flesh. She sat there, freezing to death in a forgotten room, having committed the highest crime in the kingdom, simply to keep her brother's unit alive. Lyra finally lifted her chin, her pale eyes meeting the sovereign's steady gaze. She offered no apologies, and she did not ask for mercy. The chill in her chest was absolute, but she had bought the vanguard their morning. Lyra did not beg for his belief. She did not fall to her freezing knees or attempt to leverage the permanent injury on her chest for sympathy. Instead, she turned to the heavy drafting table, dominating the center of the archive room. A single beeswax candle cast long shadows against the damp stone walls, the air smelling of dry dust, and the metallic tang of the frost burn radiating from her collarbone. Valerius Vaughan watched her in absolute, terrifying silence. The phantom heartbeat that had dragged him across the treacherous mountain range was finally settling into a steady, aching rhythm beneath his own ribs, mirroring her slow, emotional decompression. She reached out with hands that still trembled violently from the penetrating hypothermia. Her cracked knuckles were starkly pale. From beneath a stack of blank vellum, she slid out the Black Pass ledger. Its heavy, iron-reinforced spine clunked with a dull thud against the scarred oak wood. She opened it. The stiff, yellowed pages smelled of dry iron gall ink. Next to the heavy book, she unrolled a meticulously detailed topographical map of the northern ravines. Then Lyra picked up a worn wooden ruler, its edges splintered from years of guiding a cutting blade, and laid it flat across the mountainous terrain depicted in sharp charcoal lines. "The vanguard marched 3 days ago," Lyra said, her voice hoarse from the cold but completely steady. It was the tone of a woman, stating the mathematical temperature of the room, devoid of any desperate plea. "Under the command of my brother, Brandon Vance. They were ordered to hold the narrowest choke point of the Black Pass." Valerius stepped closer. His massive, armor-clad frame seemed to swallow the ambient light, his dark velvet cloak brushing the edges of the drafting table. He did not interrupt her. He possessed the rare capacity to occupy silence without the nervous impulse to fill it. Lyra slid the wooden ruler down the map, aligning its straight edge with precise red ink marks. At a standard forced march, accounting for the heavy snowfalls documented in the western quadrant, they would reach the ravine by midnight yesterday. She moved her trembling hand back to the Black Pass ledger, flipping past administrative entries to a page dated a week prior. She pressed her index finger against a specific line of text, her fingernail still faintly blue. "This is the quartermaster's logistical log," she continued, her breathing deliberately shallow to avoid aggravating the frozen tissue over her heart, signed and stamped with the wax seal of Beta Kalen Thorn. "It authorizes a secondary supply line to divert entirely away from the Black Pass, redirecting their winter rations and medical provisions to the eastern ridge." She shifted the ruler again, bridging the gap between the logbook and the map. The diversion was officially ordered 4 days before the vanguard deployed. Beta Kalen cut their survival line before they even began their march. Valerius looked down at the precise intersecting angle of the wooden ruler. The cold geometry of the betrayal was undeniable. "And the retreat order?" the Alpha King asked, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. Lyra turned a heavy page in the ledger. A crumpled copy of a tactical dispatch was pressed flat beneath the binding. "The directive to sound the Sunderhorn was drafted yesterday morning, long before any engagement began. The text states that the vanguard was overwhelmed and required an immediate extraction." She met the Sovereign's eyes directly. The vanguard was not overwhelmed. "I tracked the enemy's movements through the Border Scout reports, logged in this room. The enemy is massing heavily in the east. Beta Kalen drafted a retreat order for a battle that was not happening, intending to use the Sunderhorn to force the vanguard out of their fortified position and straight into a blind valley where they would be slaughtered. He planned to leave no survivors to contradict his narrative. The proof was laid out in simple administrative cross-referencing. Not magic, just ink, dates, and undeniable logic. The archive room plunged into a thick, suffocating silence. It was an abyssal hush, the sort that devours every lingering echo in a room. It was the heavy quiet that occurs when a structural foundation crumbles invisibly beneath a stone keep. Valerius leaned over the drafting table, bracing his large hands against the oak edge. He did not look at the horrifying sunder bruise on her chest, nor did he look at the violent trembling of her shoulders. He looked entirely at the ledgers. His leather-clad fingers traced the meticulous handwriting, squeezed into the margins of the archive logs. Every calculation was flawless. Every theoretical supply route was perfectly cross-checked with elevation gradients and historical weather patterns. Lyra had mapped out a massive conspiracy of high treason using nothing but the discarded, tedious paperwork of a corrupt pack bureaucracy. For a very long time, the Alpha King simply stared at the numbers. His inner war council was composed of the most decorated, battle-hardened wolves in the unified Northern Territories. They possessed decades of visceral combat experience and impeccable royal bloodlines. They had sat in the grand, firelit hall, drinking spiced wine, completely missing the fact that their own trusted Beta was orchestrating the systematic murder of their frontline soldiers. Kalen Thorn had smoothly fooled the entire High Court, but he had not fooled the quiet, invisible, wolfless cartographer working in the freezing basement. Valerius let that horrifying realization settle into him like cold water seeping into porous stone. Slow, thorough, filling every hidden crack. He slowly lifted his head and looked at Lyra. The contrast was staggering. She was physically fragile, her lips still lacking proper blood flow, her slender frame dwarfed by the coarse wool blankets she had hurriedly wrapped around herself. She had no inner wolf to magically heal the devastating frostburn the Sunder Horn had inflicted upon her flesh. She possessed no raw physical dominance to challenge him in the traditional witness circle. Yet she possessed a tactical mind sharper than any forged blade in his armory. She had seen the trap forming days in advance. She had mathematically calculated the exact moment its jaws would snap shut on her brother's unit. Knowing she could never convince the arrogant warlords above her, she had committed the highest form of treason. She had stolen a sacred relic and buried it directly against her own flesh, enduring hours of unimaginable physical agony just to silence the false signal that would have doomed hundreds of men. Silence was a kind of armor, thinner than most, but lighter to carry. "You did not steal the horn to betray this pack," Valerius murmured, the absolute stillness of his towering posture radiating a terrifying, tightly controlled lethality. The predatory aggression was not directed at her, but at the name written in the ledger. "I stole the horn to prevent the pack from betraying itself," Lyra answered quietly. She did not flinch or look away under his heavy gaze. The gravel of reality had bit into her palms long ago. She was entirely used to the sting of unfair systems. Valerius closed the Black Pass ledger. The heavy thump of the cold iron binding, echoing through the room, sounded exactly like a judge's gavel striking an execution block. He did not offer her a loud, dramatic declaration of eternal gratitude. Instead, he reached slowly across the drafting table and very carefully took the worn wooden ruler from her trembling fingers. He set it down on the parchment with deliberate, measured gentleness. Beta Kalen relied on the arrogant assumption that no one in the sovereign court bothers to read the quartermaster's mundane logs, Valerius said, his voice dropping into a register so dark and cold it rivaled the ambient temperature of the freezing archives. He assumed that because you have no wolf, you have no sight. He was wrong, Valerius stated, his eyes locking onto hers with a profound, terrifying respect, and he will hang for it. Valerius Vaughan stood in the freezing silence of the lower archives, the thick parchment of the forged ledger resting open on the scarred wooden table. He did not raise his voice. The authority of the sovereign was never built on volume. It was the crushing weight of his presence in a room. He turned his head by a fraction, his golden eyes piercing the dense shadows near the heavy oak door. "Orin," he said. The name dropped into the quiet like cold iron striking stone. Orin Sterling emerged from the gloom. The senior keeper of records had been standing there long enough to hear the exchange, long enough to see the frostburn, covering the draftswoman's chest, and long enough to realize that high treason had taken root under their roof. His ink-stained fingers brushed against a shelf of rolled maps. He did not bow with the frantic obsequiousness of the upper court. He simply looked at the king, and then down at the shivering woman who had committed a capital crime to save the vanguard. Valerius shifted his weight, blocking the doorway to ensure no one else could see inside. "You will lock down this entire wing of the keep," the king commanded, his voice a low hum vibrating against the stone floor. "No one enters the lower registry. You will secure her here. If Kalen Thorne attempts to breach these doors before I prepare the tribunal, you have my authority to drop the heavy iron wards." Orin offered a slow, deliberate nod. The archivist understood the tactical geometry of the situation. A loud arrest would allow Kalen's loyalists to scatter. The betrayal had to be cornered, trapped by the administrative records they had manipulated. He looked between the exhausted archivist and his sovereign, reading the heavy stillness of the room. Without a question, Orin unclasped the heavy, boiled wool cloak from his shoulders. The garment smelled faintly of dried rosemary, melting beeswax, and ancient paper. Moving with a measured dignity that ignored the pack's rigid hierarchy, the old man walked over to Lyra. He did not offer empty consolations. He draped the massive wool cloak over her violently trembling shoulders. He adjusted the heavy collar with careful hands, shielding the brutal sunder bruise from the biting draft. It was an act of profound professional solidarity. In Orin's eyes, Lyra was no longer just the invisible girl who categorized the eastern ravines. She was the soldier who held the line when the generals failed. Lyra pulled the edges of the wool tightly around herself. She had spent enough of her life learning not to break under the stares of people who assumed she was weak. She merely gave the archivist a sharp, steady nod of gratitude. Valerius watched the silent exchange, his expression unreadable, though his tight jaw betrayed a structural shift in his understanding. "Prepare the rest of the supply logs," he told Orin quietly. "We will dismantle Kaelin's legacy on the floor of the council, and we will use her ink to do it." Once Orin retreated to lock the outer iron gates, the archive room grew profoundly still. Only the sound of Lyra's ragged breathing remained, mingling with the metallic hum of the stolen artifact. The heavy artifact was no longer touching her skin, but its frost continued to bleed into the air, freezing the edges of the maps nearby. Valerius did not try to take the horn from her. He understood, with an instinctive clarity, that the relic had bonded with her physical endurance. It was her burden to put away. He stepped back, offering her the space she needed, his gaze never leaving her face. Lyra moved with stiff, aching precision. Her chest still burned with the agonizing cold of the silver, the deep tissue damage radiating a dull ache. She stepped toward a heavy, insulated cedar chest. Orin used to store alchemical inks. The wood was dense, lined with velvet, and meant to suppress temperature shifts. She reached for the sunder horn. Even through the thick wool of the cloak wrapped around her hands, the silver bit at her fingers, a hungry cold desperate to reclaim its host. She lifted the heavy war horn, her breath catching as the phantom pulse inside the metal flared one last time. Across the room, Valerius flinched, his hand flying to his chest as the phantom heartbeat struck him simultaneously. The connection was undeniable. A visceral, invisible thread pulled taut between the sovereign and the archivist. With extreme care, Lyra lowered the relic into the cedar chest. She settled it gently into the velvet lining, adjusting the jagged mouthpiece until it rested flat. Then she closed the heavy wooden lid. The brass latch clicked shut with a sharp, final snap that echoed off the cold stone walls. The instant the cedar barrier sealed the artifact away, the crushing, icy pressure in the room vanished. Lyra exhaled. It was a long, shaky breath that expelled the last remnants of her rigid tension and the bone-deep, freezing ache. At the exact same second, Valerius let out a breath of his own. The king's broad shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch, the alien drumming in his chest finally fading into a steady rhythm. The sudden absence of the cold left a strange, echoing quiet. Valerius looked at her, his golden eyes tracking the way she leaned against the wooden chest for support, her posture fiercely dignified, despite her physical collapse. The agonizing link that dragged him across the mountain range was gone, replaced by a new awareness. He could hear her real heartbeat now, not the supernatural echo inside his mind, but the quiet thudding of blood in her veins, steady and calm. "It is quiet now," Valerius said softly, his voice devoid of royal command. It was not an order. It was a confirmation of safety. "Yes," Lyra whispered, her fingers resting lightly on the cedar lid. She did not look away from him. Her quiet composure was a familiar refuge, one she slipped into with practiced ease. They stood in the dim, dust-mote-filled air of the registry, 2 people bound by a treasonous secret, breathing in the quiet aftermath of the cold. The heavy oak doors of the tribunal hall groaned shut, sealing the pack elders inside a space thick with the scent of burning pine and the sharp, sour tang of nervous sweat. The great circular chamber was a relic of older, crueler days, its tiered stone benches rising like the ribs of a massive beast around the central floor. Beta Kaelin stood at the very center of this ancient anatomy, ensuring every eye remained fixed upon him. He had called this formal assembly under the guise of an emergency inquiry, leveraging the traditionalist urgency that always accompanied a disruption of sacred pack artifacts. The Sunderhorn was gone. The implications of its disappearance were catastrophic for pack morale, and Kaelin intended to wield that communal tension with absolute precision. He paced slowly across the polished granite floor, his boots striking a measured, solemn rhythm. To complete the image of a burdened, loyal servant of the crown, the Beta reached up and adjusted the heavy fur collar of his ceremonial mantle. The dark wolf pelt settled around his broad shoulders, framing his face in a display of structural authority. He dipped his chin, letting a calculated shadow of sorrow wash over his features. When he finally spoke, his voice was not a roar, but a low, vibrating murmur designed to force the elders to lean forward, hanging on his every word. "We are not merely a military force," Kaelin began, his tone dripping with practiced reverence. "We are bound by the blood of our ancestors, by the sacred items that forge our unbroken lineage. The theft of the silver warhorn is not a simple crime of property. It is a desecration of our history. It is an act of high treason that strikes at the very throat of our pack's sovereignty." From the lower tiers, Orin watched the performance with a quiet, skeptical detachment. The old archivist stood near the shadow of a colossal stone pillar, his ink-stained fingers wrapped tightly around the spine of a mundane census record. Though his mind was cataloguing entirely different data, Orin noted the precise tilt of Kaelin's head, the deliberate pause after the word treason, the way the Beta used the weight of his collar to project an image of protective mourning. The archivist had spent 5 decades studying the body language of liars in the court, recording their testimonies into the ledgers, and this was a masterclass in misdirection. It was all a little too polished. A man truly panicked by the loss of a sacred relic would be disorganized, tearing the keep apart stone by stone, demanding immediate border closures. Kaelin was not searching, he was staging a narrative. The elders, cloaked in their own rigid adherence to hierarchy, nodded in solemn agreement, entirely missing the predatory geometry of the Beta's movements. They saw a loyal commander mourning a lost artifact. Orin saw a politician laying a very specific lethal trap, one designed to eliminate a threat without ever dirtying his own hands. Kaelin's pacing stopped abruptly. He turned his body toward the far edge of the room, his gaze sweeping past the armored guards and settling deliberately on the cluster of lower-tier servants and scribes. The silence in the chamber stretched, pulling taut like a bowstring. Without a word of warning, the Beta raised his hand, pointing a thick, leather-gloved finger directly at Lyra. The motion was sharp, a physical spear thrown across the cold room. "The desecration did not come from outside our walls," Kaelin declared, his voice rising in volume, cracking the quiet atmosphere like a whip. "It came from the shadows of our own archives, from the very dirt we allowed to walk upon our stone." Lyra did not flinch. She stood perfectly still under the sudden, crushing weight of 100 turning heads. The collective stares of the elders hit her like a physical blow, their eyes narrowing as they processed the accusation. She kept her spine rigidly straight, her hands folded neatly over the coarse linen of her skirt, concealing the faint, residual tremors that still racked her body from the freezing bite of the sunder bruise. The icy phantom of the relic still pulsed against her collarbone, a harsh reminder of the treason she had willingly committed to save her brother's unit. They expected her to cower under the weight of their scrutiny, assuming her lack of a wolf form equated to a lack of nerve. Instead, she absorbed their contempt without changing her expression, letting the coldness in her chest anchor her racing pulse. "Look at her," Kalen sneered, his lip curling in disgust as he closed the distance between the center floor and the archivist's periphery. A wolfless creature, a broken, empty vessel devoid of the instincts that bind us. We offered her charity. We gave her a desk in the dark, away from the true warriors of this pack. And how does she repay the king's mercy? With deceit. Her silence is not humility. It is the calculated quiet of a thief. The elders began to mutter, their traditionalist prejudices easily inflamed by the sight of her perceived physical limitations. Lyra listened to the rising tide of hostility, noting the precise angles of the guards, shifting their weight, their hands dropping to the pommels of their iron broadswords as they prepared to seize her. She experienced that distinct hollow ache born of realizing her worst expectations were entirely accurate. The hierarchy would always target the lowest rung to protect its highest echelon. It was easier for them to believe a quiet draftswoman was a traitor than to suspect the decorated commander standing in the center of the room. "She has stolen the ancestral horn to sabotage our vanguard," Kalen shouted, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. A wolfless spy cannot be interrogated like a true shifter. She lacks the honor of the pack. I demand her immediate execution before she can pass the relic to our enemies. Lyra's breath caught faintly, but her posture remained a column of quiet stone. She did not scream her innocence. She did not beg the elders for mercy, knowing that pleas from an Omega would only validate their contempt. Instead, she calculated the distance to the heavy oak doors, not planning an escape, but waiting for the inevitable shift in the room's atmospheric pressure. The Sovereign had promised her protection in the quiet confines of the study, and now, standing before the gathered fangs of the court, she would see exactly what that word was worth. The command for execution hung in the vaulted air of the council chamber. The armed sentries shifted their weight, preparing to seize the wolfless archivist. They expected the Alpha King to give the final nod that would seal her fate. Valerius Vaughn did not nod. He simply leaned forward. The movement was slow, devoid of the frantic energy Kalen Thorne had spent projecting. Valerius occupied the carved throne the way a glacier occupies a valley, immovable, devastating in its quiet pressure. His voice was not the deafening roar of a challenged sovereign. It was a low, dangerous rumble, pitched so precisely that it seemed to originate from the stone floor itself, freezing the guards mid-step. "You speak of treason, Beta Thorne," Valerius said, the words falling like iron weights into still water. "Yet you have not spoken of the Black Pass." Kalen halted, his self-righteous fury faltering before he smoothed it over with practiced political grace. He adjusted his uniform cuffs, though the slight tremor in his fingers betrayed a spike of adrenaline. "The Black Pass is secure, my king. The vanguard holds the line. This woman's theft. The vanguard holds the line," Valerius interrupted, his tone flattening into absolute zero, because the retreat was never sounded. "But that was not your directive, was it?" The assembly of pack elders shifted uneasily. The scent of melting beeswax from the chandeliers mixed with the sharp tang of panic radiating from the Beta. Valerius kept his gaze locked on the man, letting the full weight of his attention crush the air out of Kaelan's lungs. "Explain the troop anomalies," the king commanded, stripping away courtly protocol. "Explain why the 3rd Infantry Battalion was ordered to hold position 3 miles south of the ridge, leaving the vanguard completely unsupported. Explain why the supply lines were diverted to the eastern ravine, a route impassable under current snow conditions. You drafted those coordinates. You sealed them." Kalen swallowed hard. Tactical repositioning, Your Majesty. The enemy was shifting their archers. We had to adapt to the terrain. The terrain, Valerius repeated, tasting the word like ash. A fascinating defense. Let us consult someone who actually understands the terrain. He turned to the quiet woman standing perfectly still. Lyra, present the documents. Lyra Vance stepped forward. The toll of the freezing silver still throbbed within her sternum, a permanent ache radiating from the sunder bruise hidden beneath her wool layers. But she did not let pain dictate her posture. She moved with the steady cadence of someone used to walking through rooms where she was not wanted. Her muteness acted as a delicate but resilient shield against their scorn. She carried the heavy black pass ledger, flanked by 3 rolled parchment maps. The elders watched her with contempt, unused to seeing a cartographer operate outside the shadows of the lower keep. Lyra ignored their scrutiny. She knelt on the freezing stone floor in the center of the witness circle and laid out the evidence. The parchment unrolled with a crisp rustle that echoed loudly in the breathless hall. She smoothed the edges with ink-stained fingers, anchoring the corners with iron weights. The intricate topography of the northern ravines was drawn with absolute precision, every wind channel meticulously detailed. Beside the primary map, she opened the ledger, the binding groaning softly. The coordinates Beta Thorn issued. Lyra began, her voice perfectly clear. Do not align with the Eastern Ridge defense. They align with a structural dead end. She did not address Kaelin or look at the king to beg for validation. Instead, she turned her gaze toward the oldest traditional elder, sitting in the front row, gesturing respectfully toward the spread parchment. Elder Taurus, I invite you to inspect the marching orders, specifically the wax seals. The ancient wolf frowned, leaning heavily on his carved cane. He crossed the stone floor, standing over Lyra's carefully arranged documents. He squinted at the ledger, tracing a gnarled finger over the dried red wax stamped beside the catastrophic coordinates. The seal bears the royal crest, Kaelin snapped, his voice edging into genuine panic. She is a lowly draftswoman. She cannot read tactical commands. Quiet. Elder Taurus rasped, waving a dismissive hand. The old man leaned closer, comparing the impression in the wax to a legitimate dispatch order Lyra had placed adjacently. The crest is present, Lyra explained quietly, but the pressure of the stamp is uneven. The royal signet ring is cast in solid iron, producing a uniform depth. The seal on Beta Thorn's directive was pressed with a softer replica. A brass cast cools faster, leaving microscopic stress fractures along the outer ridge. Elder Taurus ran his thumb over the wax, feeling the precise, jagged imperfections the archivist had identified. He stared at the map, tracing the lines of the false retreat that would have funneled the vanguard directly into a slaughter. The realization settled into the old man's features, transforming his initial skepticism into absolute horror. He straightened up, turning his pale eyes toward Kaelin Thorn. The seal is a forgery, the elder announced to the silent room, his voice trembling. The coordinates are a death trap. This was not a tactical repositioning. This was an execution order. Lyra remained kneeling beside her maps, her hands resting quietly in her lap. She absorbed the familiar sting of a grim theory being proven true. She had simply let the ink, the wax, and the geometry of the mountains speak the treason Kaelin had tried to bury. The entire hall oriented toward him, the way iron filings orient toward a lodestone, their hostility shifting from the wolfless woman to the disgraced commander. The parchment of the tactical map lay utterly still against the heavy oak table, the forged coordinates speaking a truth louder than any shouted defense. Kaelin Thorn stared at the damning ink, the polished veneer of his aristocratic authority, cracking under the sheer weight of undeniable proof. He endured the specific, crushing blow of watching his inevitable doom finally arrive. The sudden realization that his intricate web of lies had unraveled exactly where he thought it was most secure. The High Council chamber, usually filled with the murmurs of elders and the shifting of armored boots, descended into a suffocating quiet. It was a consuming, absolute hush that drowned out all reason, thick with the scent of his sudden sharp terror. Desperation hijacked his logic. Realizing the bureaucratic walls had closed in on him, the disgraced Beta abandoned his political mask and fell back on the brutal hierarchy of raw force. He barked a frantic command to his personal sentries, demanding they eliminate the archivist for high treason. The guards hesitated, caught between the command of their direct superior and the towering, unmoving presence of their sovereign. That momentary delay was all it took for the traitor to snap. Drawing his broadsword with a harsh metallic scrape, the desperate commander lunged directly across the polished floor toward Lyra, intent on silencing the only witness who possessed the intellect to decode his betrayal. She did not flinch, her spine locking into a rigid line as she calculated the trajectory of the blade. She had survived the freezing bite of ancient silver. She would not cower before a coward's desperate steel. Valerius Vaughn occupied the space between them without seeming to cross the room. There was no chaotic brawl, no roar of possessive fury, only the terrifying precision of a ruler exercising absolute physical law. He caught the descending sword arm mid-strike. His grip clamped around the man's wrist like a vice of cold iron, arresting the blade mere inches from the cartographer's shoulder. The impact sent a violent shudder up the attacker's arm, stopping his momentum entirely. Valerius merely increased the pressure of his fingers against the bone. The sound of snapping metal echoed through the vaulted hall as the heavy silver rings adorning the traitor's fingers shattered under the king's devastating grip. Shards of broken jewelry dug into the man's own flesh, forcing a choked gasp from his throat. His fingers went numb, and the heavy broadsword clattered uselessly onto the cold stone floor. The sovereign released his hold, letting the disgraced warrior collapse to his knees, clutching his ruined hand in silent agony. The immediate, absolute neutralization required no further violence, proving that true authority did not need to shout to be obeyed. The sovereign gestured to the royal guards, who immediately stripped the kneeling man of his ancestral cloak and hauled him away to the deep cells beneath the keep. The threat was dissolved as clinically as a corrupted line in a ledger being crossed out with red ink. Turning his back on the retreating footsteps, Valerius addressed the stunned assembly, his low voice carrying effortlessly to the farthest corners of the tribunal. He formally cleared Lyra of all charges, stating that her supposed theft was the very act that preserved the royal vanguard from a carefully orchestrated slaughter. He explained the supernatural anomaly to the silent elders, describing how the sacred relic had bonded with a mortal pulse, broadcasting her agonizing sacrifice across the frozen mountain range when the false retreat could not be sounded. Moving closer to the woman who had risked everything, Valerius gently lifted her hand. He did not pull her into a tight embrace or demand a display of affection. Instead, he presented her frost-bitten fingers to the witness circle, the raw, cracked skin serving as undeniable evidence of her endurance. He spoke of the permanent frostburn, scarred across her collarbone, the mark of the Sunder horn, that she had borne in secret to protect soldiers she had never even met. Her heartbeat, he declared with quiet reverence, had carried more authority than the loudest war horn in the kingdom, preserving the lives of their finest warriors through sheer, unyielding willpower. Orin Sterling stepped forward from the shadows of the archive ranks, carrying the heavy, leather-bound pack registry. The old keeper laid the massive tome open on the table, his weathered hands offering a freshly dipped quill to the sovereign. Valerius signed the decree with deliberate, heavy strokes, officially stripping the traitor of his lands and titles. Then, the king turned to the blank page designated for the highest officers of the court. He wrote Lyra's name in the golden ink reserved for sovereign appointments, elevating the invisible draftswoman to the rank of high cartographer. Her status was no longer a matter of quiet survival hidden away in dusty rooms. It was a matter of structural law, witnessed and sealed before the entire pack. The tribunal slowly dispersed, the grand hall emptying until there was only the scent of melting beeswax and the distant howl of the northern wind rattling the stained glass. The freezing terror of the mountain pass finally bled out of her muscles, replaced by the steady warmth of the hearth fire burning at the edge of the room. She had buried his ancestral weapon against her own chest to save his warriors, expecting nothing but execution for her treason. Now, she stood beside the most powerful man in the territory, not as a decorative possession, but as a recognized equal whose quiet observations had saved the realm. When the sovereign offered his hand again, she took it. Not out of obedience, but because the cold silver had finally thawed, and she had found a safe sanctuary where her intelligence would always be honored.